Well, here we are on a Friday afternoon going into evening. It's just starting to go dark. It's time for me to knock off, and we made quite a bit of progress here actually with this Tiger Cub. The engine is, to all intents and purposes, fully stripped. I've managed to leave the main part of the crankcase in the frame, although I did have to remove the front two engine mounting bolts to drop the engine to get the cylinder head off, which is what you have to do on all Tiger Cubs anyway. So I got all my top end components there. There's the contents of the gearbox, so obviously check them very carefully, having been told it had jumped out of first gear. The main shaft sleeve gear is in there. That looks okay to me. No sort of rounding or anything on those dogs, so that can stay put. The timing side bush was a pleasant surprise. I couldn't detect any discernible play in that when I tried levering the crank up and down on this side, and the journal looks to be quite good as well, so maybe all that'll be alright. That'll be a bonus. Around the other side, you see I've got the crankshaft out. There it is, and as far as I've been able to tell so far, the big end feels okay, but I'll be grabbing the crank assembly a bit more firmly by some means and just making absolutely sure that the big end is okay. The gearbox sprocket is okay. If there's any doubts or any wear on them when you got one of these engines apart, the later type Tiger Cub, that you've got to take the top end off and everything to get this casing out the way to get at your gearbox sprocket, you change it while you got the opportunity. This one looks like it's been fitted not long ago, and in fact the signs that work has been done on this engine not long ago, although they've used some very strong stuff as sort of gasket sealant. I mean, you hardly needed the screws and bolts in the engine, it was stuck together that tightly with whatever stuff it was that they used. But anyway, as for the main bearing feels alright, but something's been going on here. See these four dots? Someone's tried to do something. They look like they've been drilled, and perhaps those four round bits there have been driven into holes that have been drilled. I'm not quite sure, but I can move this. Well, there you are. Got it out by hand. It's very loose in that casing, this bearing. Well, not very loose, but I think that might be where the play was coming from. So what I can do is I'm going to check the fit of this bearing, obviously on the main shaft as well. It seems to be pretty good, that actually. And what I will probably do, as the bearing itself feels okay at this stage, I may well use a bearing fitting compound to smear around there and around the bearing. I've got some really strong stuff that won't yield, and put the bearing back in, and then possibly we could be looking at just putting the engine back together. But that's what gave me the end float, because the crank is supposed to be located firmly in this main bearing when the engine sprocket and alternator rotor and everything is on and you do the nut up. This is supposed to be forced home tight against the face of the flywheel there, but I was getting end float. Well, I was getting end float because the bearing itself was moving in the crankcase in its housing, and I think that tiny little bit of play was more than likely down to this just being a little too loose in the housing. So it might not be an expensive fix as far as parts and any machining I might have thought might have needed doing beforehand. It all looks to me as if I can deal with this here, the fit of it into this housing in the crankcase, and possibly be able to put everything back together again, and perhaps everything will be alright. The engine sounded quite good when it was running. There was the odd little clunk there because I did look at the tappets, but I think what I was hearing was coming from down here. But you don't want any end float on the crankshaft on the Tiger Cub. It's always located tightly to the drive side. If it's allowed to float, it'll knock about and clunk against this face on the timing side bush and not do that any favours. So it's Probably a bit of a disappointment to the owner that this thing had to come apart to do the job, but hopefully it'll please him to see that there's nothing badly damaged or worn in there, and just putting everything back together carefully with a little bit of compound, bearing fitting compound on this, is probably going to do the job. And later next week I would think that we might have it up and running again and ready to go home. And if it needs any parts for the gearbox, I've got loads of gearbox parts, so that's not going to be a problem if I find anything there. So we're ending on a sort of a high note on a Friday. Things could have been a lot worse, so take it from me, that's not a bad place to be.